Good morning. I know Brad said you're all here for the technical aspects of NOFO 3, but I'd argue to say that you're all here for how do I position my application to be robust and competitive along with all of the applications that were submitted. So I won't even really bore you with too much grant stuff today. But next slide, please. So the first start of the process of applying for the Innovation Fund is registering through SAM.gov and grants.gov. SAM.gov is where you obtain your unique entity identifier, the UEI, and that allows you to register an account with grants.gov. There's a whole process involved here on the slides and in the NOFO that detail what you need to do in order to do that portion of the process. I will emphasize that sometimes there's a delay obtaining your SAM.gov registration and UEI number. And it's two distinct pieces. It's the UEI number and the registration. If you've already registered through SAM.gov, there is an expiration of your registration. So please take a look at, log in to SAM.gov and see what your expiration date is. And if need be, get current before the application is submitted. Okay, next slide, please. So here we have the one or two things that you need to submit with your application. But the one good thing about the NOFO, while it is a bit of a novel, for the majority of the substance of the application, the technical proposal, the work plan, the transition plan, the IP plan, we have in the NOFO detailed information as to what those need to include, including the page limitations. So please take a look at that information to ensure that you're meeting the mark. Someone once asked me, well, how do you write a good grant application? And we said, we tell you in the NOFO. We tell you how it's going to be evaluated and what needs to be in there. So if you follow the individual headings, pieces to the puzzle, you'll put forth a strong application. Let's see, just some other items related to submitting your documentation. Please don't submit your application package as one big PDF. We need the documents submitted individually, so an individual work plan, individual budget, and on down the lines. And to maintain the Excel file that is the budget, narrative, and justification sheet, that has to stay in Excel. All right. And obviously no one's mentioned here yet that the deadline for the application submission is 11:59 p.m. Eastern, I guess daylight savings time by then, March 17th. So again, just like in school, don't wait to the last minute to get started. There are a lot of requirements here. And to have a strong application, there needs to be detailed thought and an organization to the information. Next slide, please. Okay, construction. For NOFO 3, construction is now eligible. And just some important pieces to highlight about construction. If you haven't had an opportunity to engage with the federal government on a grant before that involved construction, this may be new to you. And it's only eligible for the SFRA 1 projects. What happens when federal funds are used for a particular project? The moment there is ground disturbance or expanding a footprint of a facility, we want to make sure that there are no impacts to historical neighborhoods or buildings, as well as the environment. People used to laugh about the spotted owls, but this is kind of what's involved, particularly in using the example that we have here, the construction or perhaps building upon a tower, because there are environmental and potential historical impacts for doing that. So alongside the bullets here, we've provided some additional information that isn't in the NOFO as a requirement. It would be considered as other documents, providing a really detailed description of the construction project and the extent of the proposed ground disturbances and potential how the land use and natural features at this site will be impacted by this construction. For example, if you're anywhere near tribal lands, that could be have some additional requirements associated with the project because of that. And then lastly, maps and photographs, Google Maps, that is certainly acceptable. Screen caps for that to get started. If you have a construction project, the construction project cannot be started, even if you are successful, until you receive approval from NTIA to proceed. We have a whole team back at NTIA that does environmental reviews, and they will make sure that we are maintaining our responsibility to this country's environmental and historic assets. Next slide, please. Okay, forms. Everybody loves forms. But some of the, what we're going to talk about here, the 424 and the 424A, those are sort of the basic grants forms that no matter what program you're applying for, you have to fill out the SF 424 and the 424A. And you'll see here, there's a place for you to enter in your, what you're bringing to the table as the applicant. And then more importantly, I'm not sure if anyone would have state resources being brought to the project, but D, other sources. If you're sub-recipients or contractors, there's some cash match involved. That would be a place to provide that information. But all the federal forms have detailed instructions on what's supposed to go where. And that should be easy to follow. And one thing I'll touch on here, since we're looking at the 424A and it's related to the budget, to talk about the cost share. As mentioned earlier, there's a 30% for SRFA1 projects, as well as a 20% match for the SFRA2. For anyone that had applied for SFRA1 for NOFO 2, you may recall there was a range of a multiplier that could be added to your final score to give you a plus up or a bonus at the end of the process. That is not the case here. So there will be no benefit to you committing more funds purposefully versus it's just you have multiple partners, there's a lot coming to the table. Because when you apply for a federal grant, the cost share is reported in your grant award, and you're expected to expend that within the period of performance of the grant period. So the regular financial reports, you got to talk about how you spent your federal funds, but you also need to talk about how you expended the cost share funds. Let's see about cost share. So cost share, it can only be for eligible activities under the grant program. You can't just decide that, oh, we have this thing over here and we're going to put that as part of our cost share. No, it has to be eligible under the program, and it must be allocable in terms of you can put a dollar amount associated with it. And let's say, oh, cost share as it relates to indirect costs. Indirect costs are eligible to be used as cost share, except if you're using the de minimis. And I'll talk about that in another slide. But again, the NOFO goes into great detail about the cost sharing, and we can certainly answer questions today or at a later date as you start working through your applications. Now, as Richard mentioned earlier, there is a priority. While no additional points are awarded for over and above the minimum cost share, there is a multiplier, a 5% multiplier available for small businesses. And that's for 500 employees or less. And that would be identified in your 424. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, the big document, the budget narrative and justification. We have a very large spreadsheet that has all of the direct costs as well as the indirect costs for you to enter into a single place where we can see your budget at the 500,000 feet and then at the 2,000 feet level. Okay, so it needs to be consistent across the board. So when you have the information in the budget worksheet, we're going to be looking back at the 424 and the 424A to make sure that these all line up. If there's a discrepancy, that makes it difficult for reviewers to determine whether or not a project is cost effective, or are there some costs that are not being reported that could be unallowable. In the spreadsheet, we probably should have done a screen cap of that to show you, but if you've been online already to see our documents for this package, you'll see that there's always an opportunity to provide information. There's always a place to, if it's not intuitive what the item is or what it's for, to certainly describe what the item is. And it's certainly helpful as we get through the process to be very clear. This is a very technical program, but still providing some plain English is always helpful, particularly when it comes to the budget. Let's see, so we got the rationale, we got the market share. Okay, so just want to touch on ineligible costs. Construction's not eligible for FRA2. And pre-application expenses are not allowable. For example, some of the awards that are being awarded for NOFO 2 had a period of performance start date of January 1st. Expenses that you've encumbered prior to January 1st cannot be expended or associated with the project because it has to be done within the period of performance. Okay, and equipment, supplies, and services. As you know, we have identified in section 6.1.3 about the countries of concern. And I don't want to say any more about that. But regardless of what level your funding is trickling down, it can't be in any way, shape, or form awarded to one of the countries of companies that are based in the countries of concern. There we go. And just one of the lessons we learned from NOFO 2, there's a difference between subrecipients and contractors. And it's important to identify that up front, and it has to do with their level of involvement in the project. Because the subrecipients versus contractors, those are inputs into the calculation of their direct cost rate, part of the cost share, as well as the calculation for the small business plus up. This 40% of the funds are required to be awarded to, and that would be as a sub-award, not a contract. Either to the direct recipient or a subrecipient, 40%. So if you're using subrecipients to meet the plus up for small business, please indicate that that is what you're doing so we can, again, it helps with doing the math. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is sort of the last check, last look before you hit submit in grants.gov is making sure, particularly the budget, is correct, making sure that it aligns with the 424, making sure that there is descriptions provided, also just ensuring that you're using the most recent version of your documents. You probably have a team of 20 people perhaps working on the application and providing inputs to it, and everyone's saving over documents, and it may not be the last one that you're working on. So please coordinate amongst your team and make sure that the most current documents are submitted, because whatever is submitted is what will be reviewed. Oh, and there is a further explanation in the budget narrative about the small business meeting the 40%. There is a summary page tab in the budget narrative worksheet that sort of additional information at the bottom, and that's where you can provide some of that detailed information straight away. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, the information on the right focuses about subrecipient versus contractor. And basically, a contractor is someone that you're just buying stuff from. They're not necessarily providing strategic vision for your project or technical expertise to implementing your project. And that's a contractor. And the subrecipient is really a party to the grant as far as accomplishing the purpose of the award. So please ensure as you are finalizing your documentation that's clear and that they are clearly identified in the budget narrative. And indirect costs. Okay, this is a fun topic. So if you have a negotiated indirect cost rate, and that may come from HHS, submit that with your application, and you can use that in your budget calculations. However, if you haven't done business with the government before and have an indirect cost rate, we have something called the de minimis rate. It's 15%, and there's a whole calculation. In our budget narrative worksheet, it tells you what elements of your application are needed to calculate the 15%, the modified total direct costs, MTDC, the base, and that's what's applied. The 15% is applied to that. Also, if you feel that you are going to be working with the government in the future, you can also negotiate an indirect cost rate. That's something that would not be finalized if you are successful before your award. It might take some negotiation with NIST, who services our grants, but that is an option as well. Next slide, please. And then lastly, for applicants that have multiple projects, since you can submit up to 3 applications for SFRA1, please submit them separately. 3 distinct applications in grants.gov. Please make sure that your attachments are corresponding correctly, etc. And if you are by chance submitting an SFRA1 and an SFRA2, those also need to be separate submissions. Each one is a unique project. And just a couple of best practices here at the bottom. Please ensure you reference which research area focus you're applying for and project subtypes. And again, using a naming convention for your files that we know what they are, what applicant they're associated with, and if you have multiple projects, which project.